Okay, so this presentation sort of recalls the first section of this conference today, and it's on how populist leaders, basically how they performed during COVID. So I'm going to cover a few different topics: the types of policies they pursued, how they did in terms of cases and deaths, and also how the pandemic affected support for populists. So let's start with the big picture here. These are data that we put together at the Institute. We have a populist empowered database that we update every year, and it's basically we code leaders as populists. And we found that during the last year in 2021, I just updated the database last month, we had the biggest decline in the number of populist leaders ever, down from 17 to 13. So biggest one-year decline and back down to its lowest level since 2004. Now, so you look at this and you might think, well, that's the biggest decline ever is during COVID. Now, of course, there was also a slight decline in the years before. So I wouldn't say that we can say for sure that it's due to COVID, but it certainly gives something to investigate here. And indeed, some of the early reactions to the pandemic with respect to populists are that this is going to be a really bad thing for populist leaders. So the populist revolution may become a victim of COVID. COVID is going to kill off populism. We are seeing headlines like these in pretty big places during those opening weeks of COVID. And I mean, I think this is certainly to the audience here, but even maybe a bit more broadly, this is something that was kind of sensible, right? Because when we think about populist leaders, well, what are they? Well, one of the things they advertise themselves as is they're anti-establishment. So we don't need the experts. We can rely on the will of the people. We listen to them, and that's all you need to do good governance. And politics is often more about show than substance for them. Of course, they wouldn't say this, but this is something that the people at least have a lot of sense of. Specifically in health policy, there's little concern for that. This is not an area that they really discuss. And it's not that all populists do bad in a crisis, but this is really the wrong kind of crisis for populists. A pandemic is the kind of crisis where we want the health experts to come out and tell us what to do because we don't know what to do, and we want the kinds of politicians who are going to listen to them. So this was not looking like it would be a good crisis for populists. Well, okay, so this is my job to investigate stuff like this. So what do I do is I'm like, well, let's see, we only have 18 of these guys in our database. So that's a small enough sample that I can just read about them individually. So I published a report in August 2020 where I just looked at how populist leaders, all the populist leaders, had been responding to the pandemic during those first few months. So what were their initial reactions? I mean, a lot of the headlines that populists are doing poorly in the pandemic, they're focused on Trump and Bolsonaro, who were two populists who had downplayed COVID. But what about the other 16? So I looked into this and I found that actually only 5 of 18 populist leaders around the world had downplayed COVID during these early months. But of the other 13, the ones who had taken it seriously, I still found some differences in responses. Most of those responded similarly to non-populist democratically elected leaders. Listened to experts, same kind of policies. 5 of 13 took what I called illiberal responses. So involving things like very punishing lockdowns. If you remember those first few months in India, there was, Modi basically put a stop on all travel, which is a big problem in India because there's a lot of internal migration for work, so people couldn't get home. Excessive emergency powers in some countries, biased enforcement where there's more cracking down on political opponents for violating COVID protocol than supporters. So things like this. And I had this table in my piece. This just goes through who is in each of the categories. Probably not surprising. I'd note that I classified Lukashenko and Ortega in Belarus and Nicaragua as having downplayed COVID. They certainly did, although you might quibble with the fact that we classify them as populists. Basically, we do that. I mean, they're certainly dictators now, but we classify them as populists because they were elected in free and fair elections as populists originally, and they've been in power ever since. So we continue to code them as populists till they fall out of power. Again, the illiberal ones on the bottom, this is probably not too surprising a list for many of you. Okay, so that was a bit on populist leaders around the world in the sort of first few months of COVID. I wanted to look a bit further into what was going on with populist parties in Europe, because at least in Western Europe, and this was my focus in the second report from early last year, There aren't any populist leaders in power. Well, except in Italy. I didn't focus on Italy. I focused on, Northern and Western Europe. But of course, you have a lot of right-wing populist parties. So I wanted to see how they responded. And I found that, like most populist leaders around the world, they took COVID pretty seriously. I mean, in some cases, like with Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders, they were criticizing their governments for not doing enough in the early weeks of COVID. And Marine Le Pen, used this to play right into her, ongoing narrative of, we need to close the borders, we need to reduce globalization. If I had been in power, none of this would have happened. I'm not the only one that found populists across Europe took COVID pretty seriously. Casmude and his graduate student Jakob Wandries also found that populist leaders across Europe, so in Eastern Europe, they implemented similar policies to non-populists. So this is another report I did. I also looked at this in 2021. I wrote a blog post for the LSE where I looked at, sort of with more perspective, where I can actually collect data on this, how populists differ from other types of leaders in terms of their policy stringency. So this is the Oxford Index of, basically the seriousness of policies to respond to COVID. And then also to get at this idea of illiberalism, pandemic democratic violations. These are data from VDEM, and like usual with data from VDEM, it includes a lot of different stuff. But so I investigate, first of all, populists, all populists, the total sample, no real difference in, policy seriousness. But this masks some interesting heterogeneous effects, if you will. I then broke down populists into how they responded in the first few weeks of COVID, the ones who downplayed it, the ones who were serious but liberal, the ones who were serious but illiberal. And I found very different policy responses. So the ones who were serious but illiberal, even through summer 2021, we still find that they have higher policy stringency than all other types of leaders. Whereas the ones who downplayed it, again, they are still overall downplaying it relative to other types of leaders. The results on the right, probably a little bit less surprising, that populists would engage in more democratic violations during COVID. So this involves a lot of the stuff that I talked about on the previous slide about, excessive emergency powers, biased crackdowns, things like this. Yelling at the media is another thing that VDEM includes in these data. So yeah, not surprising that a lot of populists had more of these during the pandemic. Okay, so that's the first few months of COVID. So how did populist leaders, how did their responses evolve? So if you remember, the first wave of COVID was mostly in Western Europe and the Americas. Even Eastern Europe didn't really get hit by the first wave of COVID. And this created a false sense of security, among populists in Eastern Europe and Asia, but really among a lot of leaders around the world. Across Africa, there are pretty relaxed attitudes toward COVID, and there have been since not too long after it started. But the second wave then came and hit Eastern Europe very hard, and since then it's had some of the highest case and death rates in the world. And then the third wave in winter and spring of 2021 hit South and Southeast Asia very hard, and especially India. And I went on Fareed Zakaria's show on CNN last May to talk about all of this, and the occasion for it was because India had been hit so hard by COVID, and there were a lot of questions about how Modi was handling things. He had relaxed restrictions for religious gatherings and for political rallies among his supporters, which many thought was a bit ironic in light of his earlier crackdown on Muslims earlier in the pandemic for violating a COVID protocol. So at this point, again, this is in the same piece that I presented the data on the policy stringency and democratic violations earlier. So summer last year, I looked at how populists were doing in terms of cases and deaths. And so again, all populists, and then I broke it down by downplay, liberal, and illiberal, the three types from the early COVID responses. And overall, I found it's, whether you'd call it a small effect, I don't know, 1,000 deaths per month more, is that a small effect? That's something. It's, marginally significant, so it's a bit noisy. And we find that this positive effect is driven by populists who downplayed COVID and those who were serious but illiberal. And this is interesting because if you remember on the previous slide, I showed that the populists who were serious but illiberal had taken more stringent responses. So they had, greater lockdowns, this kind of thing. Yet they still had more deaths than other types of leaders, which is very interesting. I mean, the coefficients are statistically insignificant, but I mean, the difference between this insignificance and statistical significance is probably, to paraphrase Andy Gelman, statistically insignificant. So yeah, some evidence of a positive relationship there. Okay, so now on the sort of other side of this, how did COVID affect support for populists, right? So, I mean, this is another thing. You look at Donald Trump, he lost the election. I think a lot of people thought he lost the election because of COVID. I investigated this a few times as well. First, in fall of 2020, I looked at support for different types of parties in Europe over the first few months of COVID. So this is for 9 Western European countries. And I broke parties down into 4 types. So one, the lead party in a coalition government, so like Merkel's CDU, then also other parties in a coalition government, then mainstream parties not in government, and then finally right-wing populist parties, or as we call them, cultural populist parties, none of which were in government in the 9 countries that I looked at. And so what I expected to find was a general boost of support for all mainstream parties at the expense of populist parties. That isn't really what I found. The main thing I found is that there was a big boost in support for the lead party in government, but that was it. Other mainstream parties did not benefit from COVID. It's true that the right-wing populists took the biggest hit from COVID, but as you see here, by fall 2020, at least in these 9 countries, this had already kind of declined. So I interpreted this in this blog post that I wrote as sort of a rally around the flag or rally around the leader, but it was specifically rallying around the leader and the leader's party, not all parties in government, and certainly not all mainstream parties. And then I've examined this again more recently. In fact, very recently, this piece was just published in one of the LSE blogs at the end of last month. So I wanted to expand my sample and look at a broader range of countries over a longer period of time, how support for leaders was affected by COVID. Because again, Trump struggled. He lost further support among white college educated people, lost support in the suburbs, and this is probably why he lost. Bolsonaro appears likely to lose to Lula coming up this year. But again, like I found, a lot of populist leaders took COVID seriously. So did they lose support too? And so what I did is I wanted to get, pretty regular polling data, so monthly, weekly polling data. These aren't available, as far as I know, for all leaders around the world. So I used this for just for Europe, and I looked at 24 European countries. So this time, both Western and Eastern Europe. And so here's what I found. So the top panel here, the blue line is support for all parties in government that are populist, that have a populist leader. And if we see this before the pandemic kicks in March, April 2020, populist-led governments are actually have higher support than non-populist-led governments. But this immediately flips with COVID, and then it remains the opposite throughout COVID, that non-populist-led governments are more popular than populist-led ones. It flips back at the end, but at this point, several populist leaders had lost in Eastern Europe. And the next 2 panels here, figures 4B and 4C, plot for populist-led governments and non-populist-led governments, respectively, how they polled against death rates in those countries. So the red lines in both of these graphs are the death rates, and the blue line is the support for that type of government. And as we see in the bottom panel here, when we got the first death spike, non-populist government support went up. So that's consistent with what we saw a few graphs back with the boost for leader parties in Western Europe. Whereas populist-led governments, they didn't get any kind of boost during the first death spike. In fact, we see a gradual decline after that. And then with the second death spike, again, a bit more of a decline, not a sharp decline ever, but a gradual decline. With the non-populist-led governments, we get this first spike in support, and then it just kind of stays at a high level. Again, doesn't really change with the second death spike. So, I mean, I mean, the most striking thing in this graph is non-populist led government increase in support with the death spike. But then after that, the interesting thing is just like the difference in the trend overall between populist and non-populist. Populist gradual decline throughout, non-populist boost, and then stays at a relatively high level. Okay, so what do we take from this? I mean, what do we expect that the consequences of COVID will be for populism? So I've written about this in a report updating our data set that came out at the beginning of last month. You might interpret this as a sort of flight to seriousness during events like a pandemic, right? Where, again, like I mentioned in an early slide, there's increased support for establishment politicians because they're the ones that we see as following the advice of the experts, and that's the kind of thing that we want in this uncertain environment. And I mean, but of course, populists did worse even when they took COVID seriously, which is a bit puzzling. But you might interpret this, and I certainly can't uniquely identify this explanation with any of my data, but you might think of this as, in these sort of heightened times like a pandemic, people just may become more likely to be tired of such types of leaders, even if they don't do a bad job with COVID per se. If they do a bad job with something else, your patience is running out for this kind of leadership. And so we might think that this is part of the reason why populists immediately start to lose support when the pandemic hits, even though a lot of them took it seriously. Going forward, I'm a bit skeptical that COVID per se is going to have much of an effect on populism going forward. Perhaps if mainstream politicians push excessive lockdowns. I mean, there's been some backlash to this, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States. It's unlikely to be a major issue, although we do have issues with vocal minorities who are linked to populists, like we're seeing with this ongoing issue with the Canadian truckers. Populists could benefit from the turmoil of a hard economic landing if there's something like interest rate increases, but that's not really. I wouldn't say that that's an effect of COVID per se. And the research on crises and populism has found that populists benefit from financial and banking crises, not from general economic downturns so much. So I think a bit more interesting is to think about COVID aside, what do populist prospects look like going forward, and especially how might the opposition counteract populism, or how might they get some of these leaders out of power? Well, they have one thing working in their favor, I think, which is that a lot of these populist leaders have been in power a long time. And I mean, in the beginning, they blame establishment politicians for everything that goes wrong. Well, clearly they're the establishment now. When you're in power for 15 years, there's no one else to blame. And people just get sick of leaders, populist or not. People get sick of leaders after many years of them being in power. In my report that I published a few weeks ago, I looked at these election losses in 2021, and I found that 3 of the 4 elections where a populist leader lost. The opposition parties, which of very different substantive commitments, they focused their campaigns entirely on removing the populist leader. This appeared to be successful in Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Israel. And we see the same thing happening in Hungary, where there's an election coming up this year, and it's also happening in Turkey. But I think the difference between Hungary and Turkey is that, especially in Turkey, these leaders have put up much greater institutional roadblocks. So they have, I think, they have much more protection from institutions. Like, it's going to be easier for them to stay in power. There's probably also a higher chance of electoral corruption in especially Turkey. So leaders this past year who lost didn't do that. I mean, one of the things I wrote about is it was surprising. Like, no one followed Trump this past year. No one left office, kicking and screaming the way Trump did. They all kind of just left. But then there's a further issue. If it takes, an ideologically disparate opposition uniting to dislodge populists, what chance do these parties have if they form a government? I mean, it's one thing to unify to get rid of someone. It's a different thing to unify to govern. And so I write about the case of the Israeli government, which is its most diverse ever, and it's a minimal winning coalition. They have a majority of 1 seat. And they're really unified by fear that if they fail, Netanyahu's going to return. And so they're doing everything they can to prevent this from happening. And some of the things they've done, which is what I would advocate, as far as policy measures to take for these kind of governments, is you should focus on institutional changes to prevent populist retrenchment. So the Israeli coalition is pushing term limits for prime ministers, and other less controversial policies. So again, the Israeli coalition is pushing a lot of less controversial social welfare measures. So that's my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyer, for the presentation. You have several minutes for questions and comments and feedback. Anyone? Elisa? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself. Again, excuse the wind if any strange noises happen. The wind is really very strong here. Why was there actually, do you think, the expectation that populists wouldn't take COVID seriously? And when they did did it always play into the same kind of like populist game of, I don't know, using circumstances to contribute to their cult of leadership or whatever it was?
Should I respond, or are we going to take multiple questions?
Are there other questions? You might want to respond to this one until we wait other questions.
Yeah, so I mean, in the beginning, I mean, most of the headlines that I saw in those first few weeks were, yeah, this is going to be a problem for populists. And so, I mean, there were probably some people who are saying, well, they might take advantage of this. And this is kind of one of the things that I thought is there is something they could take advantage of here. Like, don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? I mean, if you're a kind of guy who wants to, further entrench your power, if you like cracking down on people, well, this is a great opportunity to do that. And we did see that with some of these populist leaders that I put in my illiberal category. So yeah, I mean, personally think, and I think a lot of people think this, that Trump missed an opportunity to act like this, to take it very seriously. And show that he can do that. And then he also gets one of the other things he wants, which is to, consolidate his power. So, yeah, I mean, I think, certainly some did that. And some people noted that it would be a good idea for populists and kind of consistent with a lot of the rest of what they do for them to crack down like this.
Thank you. Other questions? Comments for Dr. Meyer's presentation? Hearing none. Oh, Neil, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I'm just wondering about how gauging the effectiveness of populist responses to COVID. How do you take account for external factors? I mean, if, for example, you're Hungary and you're surrounded by states with a high capacity, then your ability to deal with COVID is to some extent affected by the external environment around you and other states' abilities to deal with it, their ability to lock their populations down. Whereas if you're in India and you're, you're next door to Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal, your ability to deal with COVID is not going to be helped by your environment. So I was just wondering how you kind of control for those factors when you're comparing across such a range of cases.
So I guess the best answer to this is a technical one, and those results were based on regression analyses that controlled for a few additional things. So one is region, because one of the things that I wanted to pick up is like these things come in waves, but they're multiple countries within a region are affected at the same time. So I put those in. So I mean, you'd expect the cases and deaths to be higher in Hungary when they're higher in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, other neighboring countries. And then also, I mean, another basic control is just level of development. And so those graphs that I presented with the point estimates controlled for some of these basic things for regional fixed effects, for level of development, and then also some basic stuff about the country's like health infrastructure. There's some work by scholars at the WZB in Berlin where they put together all these data on COVID, the political and social correlates of COVID data set. And I followed their recommendations on how to do these regressions. So yeah, I tried to account for some of this.